So my name is Robert Taylor. I'd like to welcome you to the Group Dynamics Seminar. And this term, the seminar is sponsored by the Program for Research on Black Americans and the Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging Research. This seminar is one of the longest running seminar series in the social sciences. The Program for Research on Black Americans was founded by James Jackson in 1976 and has conducted several major surveys of African Americans. It also has a major training mission and has trained hundreds of students and postdocs over its more than 40-year history. For instance, there's really too many to mention, including Courtney as an example. But 9 former students became full professors here at the University of Michigan, and 3 of them are collegiate professors. And that includes myself and Dr. Lynn Cherries. So today we are really pleased that Courtney Cogburn is here to talk about, to speak in our winter seminar series. She's an assistant professor at Columbia, and she's also on the faculty of the Columbia Population Research Center. Dr. Cogburn is interested in the ways we characterize and measure racism and the effects of racism on racial inequalities in health. She and 2 of our other speakers in this series, Tanae Lewis, who spoke last week, and David Williams, who will be speaking in about a month or so, have a major review article in the Annual Review of Clinical Psychology on Discrimination in Health. And before we start, I just want to mention 1 or 2 things. So number 1, there's a few refreshments in the back, if you care to have any. Number 2, we have a seminar. We have 2 more social workers coming later this term. And on top of that, David Williams is coming, and many other, both very senior and some very junior researchers who all mostly do research on health inequalities and wealth inequalities. Let me just mention 1 last really important thing about Dr. Cogburn. She received her MSW from where? University of Michigan. Mm-hmm. And her PhD in the combined ed psych program here at the University of Michigan. So let's please give a warm welcome to Dr. Courtney Cogburn.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining me in the snow. I was only expecting like 2 people, Rob and Linda, but it's great to see you be here, and I'm delighted to talk about this work. This is work I've been working on really in earnest for the past 3 years, but it's been a complicated journey for me. You'll see like how I'm trying to bridge multiple disciplinary perspectives and developing this work, so it's been a challenge. So it's been good to kind of firm it up and be in a place to be able to present it to you today, so I look forward to your feedbacks and thoughts. I opted to give you a breadth of things I'm working on rather than doing any one deep dive, but I'm happy to go into more detail of any of the multiple projects that I'll be talking about. As Robert said, Dr. Taylor said, I am trained in psychology and social work and education. I also did a postdoc in public health, so I'm a little all over the place, and that's reflected in my work as well. But really, I was sharing with someone earlier that a senior colleague at Columbia once told me at a dinner reception. She said, there are people who solve the problems of their discipline, and there are people who solve the problems of the world. And I fall firmly into that latter category, which means there's no one discipline that's going to fix the problem of racism and racial inequalities in health. So I really rely on those multiple perspectives to try and make some progress in this area. So my work is really grounded around this question of why does race matter for health, and I push against strict epidemiological approaches that rest on describing differences across groups and never take the next step to explain what is it about race that's actually contributing to these patterns that we're observing in population health. And so my work is trying to contribute to scholars who are interested in taking that next step, building on the vast body of work that's already been developed in this area, and digging specifically into cultural racism. I like this framing that the struggle against oppression and exploitation is most powerfully resisted and maintained on cultural terrain. So the work that I'll focus on at the beginning is about the maintenance of inequality and oppression through cultural means. And the final project that looks at the use of virtual reality will talk about how can we use a cultural tool to actually push us in a different direction. So I will talk about some conceptual work and thinking I've been doing around cultural racism, again, pulling from multiple disciplinary perspectives. And then I'll briefly give you an overview of 3 different empirical examples that are trying to push the ways we might measure when I'm trying to describe conceptually 3 different approaches I'm taking to do that. So the first part in terms of really for me is about framing the problem, and really in this piece calling into question I think major gaps in 2 areas of work. So one, culture and population health. There's been this increased commitment to understanding social determinants of health. The language of culture has become more prominent. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is describing the culture of health, thinking about developing a shared national priority for health, but also including creating healthier, more equitable communities, Healthy People 2020s, referencing the aggregate of social and cultural institutions, norms, patterns, beliefs, and processes, sorry for the typo, that influence the life of individuals living in our society. And what I would argue is that this perspective, this shift in population health is really, really important. But to me, there are some major gaps. So there's some, in my perspective, an under-conceptualization of what culture is. So we're referencing that, yes, cultural processes and norms are important. I'm not seeing so much the next step of actually explaining what that is, what the mechanisms are that go from these cultural processes to health. In very, very narrow frames of what cultural threats are. So we're thinking about, say, from the Healthy People 2020 perspective, thinking about resources in a neighborhood, but not thinking about ways in which I'll unpack in a little bit, ways in which culture communication is playing a role in how we're understanding our health, how we're understanding race and racism, et cetera. And I also see a problem within this body of literature and these developing kind of initiatives, this disconnect from racism. So there's the study of race and consideration of race without considering racism. So you have that kind of body of work that's really, I would argue, failing to integrate important existing long-standing conceptual models that have unpacked methodological approaches, have made recommendations for policy and practice, and this body of work consistently and routinely ignores that work or doesn't meaningfully integrate it. And then you have people, multidimensional models of racism, structural racism, who are thinking more explicitly about culture and cultural processes. They're naming those things explicitly. So models of structural racism will talk about the ways in which cultural processes reinforce structures and institutions. People who think explicitly about cultural racism as a distinct phenomenon, not just something that undergirds structures. They're thinking about systems of social and cultural phenomena that promotes white superiority. And there are also people who are thinking about racism-related stressors. So they're thinking about cultural exposures as a source of social toxicity, something that we're exposed to all the time. I study that through media, and what are the implications from health if we're thinking about cultural racism in that way. There are also some gaps from people who work in this space. So there's a dominant focus on individual experiences with racial discrimination in the health literature. People think about this in multiple ways, but we still mostly focus on individual reports of being treated differently on the basis of race. So there also is a disconnect between our conceptual models and our empirical research. We repeat it, like David Williams. I was just looking at his most recent review article. He made some of the same arguments in 2009 about what the gaps are, what the important priorities are, and the empirical research hasn't really kept up with people saying over and over, we need to be measuring racism in a more comprehensive way. We need to be thinking about mechanisms that underlie these exposures to health. And so there's an ongoing disconnect between these really rich conceptual models and what we actually do in our empirical scholarship. And even some of the more recent work that's grounding and thinking about these more cultural exposures. So for instance, work that's thinking about aggregated bias, doing Google searches of the N-word and linking that to health in these really interesting ways, often don't frame that work in cultural frameworks. So they're not thinking about how that's actually culture. And I and others would make the argument that framing it from a cultural perspective is actually really important for creating a cohesive body of literature that's focused on that, and really drawing from the ways in which people have talked about cultural systems to inform what we think we're observing in relation to health. So I started to draw from cultural sociology. I drew from psychology, media and communication studies and how these different groups are thinking about culture, and started to kind of draw from this standing framework around how we might categorize different elements of culture and applying that specifically to population health. So in this particular model, they're thinking about symbolic boundaries, so implicit principles that determine our social status and value, status hierarchies that think about who's more central or distal to the margins of our community, various types of racial frames that we use, and how those racial frames influence our institutional practices and norms, etc. So it's really starting to think about how do we categorize and make sense of this vast world of culture, particularly in terms of thinking about cultural threat. How can we use existing frameworks like this one to start to categorize that research? So I wanted to give you quickly just a couple of examples of existing work that I'm just reorganizing, right, and saying that we're all talking about the same thing essentially. So prominent work around racial frames and racial ideology from Bonilla Silva and Joe Fagan around thinking about the interpretive tools we use to justify racial inequality. In population health, we see a leaning toward explaining inequalities in health based on failures of the group or things that the individuals in that group are doing, as opposed to prioritizing the structures and systems that are creating barriers to health. That is an ideology. That's a framing of a particular problem, and there's different ways in which these racial frames show up. So really thinking about not only as these racial frames as just cultural phenomena, but specifically thinking about two things. One, the ways in which they shape our behavior, our attitudes, our institutional norms, and also the ways in which these frames can serve as an exposure to racism-related stress. So even hearing people talk and think about race in a particular way in public discourse, I would argue could be a source of stress that could have an impact on health. And I'll explain how I'm looking at that empirically. Other examples are dog whistles. So in this example here, Paul Ryan is blaming poverty on lazy inner city men. In the same interview, he cites Charles Murray, who has argued that blacks are genetically inferior. Paul Ryan doesn't say blacks are genetically inferior. He uses racial codes like lazy inner city men and cites someone who says that blacks are genetically inferior. So in this paper, I'm really trying to unpack these complex uses of language that are a form of a cultural system, that are making expressions of racial superiority or inferiority. It also shows up in patterns in our media representation and bias. So again, drawing from a vast research literature from communications and media studies that are documenting these patterns and how we represent criminals, how we represent victims, in addition to what we see on popular television shows and what those representations might mean. So again, this body of work would frame these patterns as cultural, but what this paper is trying to do is say that what Bonilla Silva and Fagan are talking about in terms of racial frames and dog whistles and people in media studies, we're all actually talking about the same phenomena, and maybe we should put this under the same umbrella so that we can learn from those different perspectives. It also shows up in the ways in which we frame history, right? This is a clip from an elementary school textbook. It says, when the European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations people agreed to move to different areas to make room for new settlements. So this whitewashing of history, this misrepresentation of history, is a use of cultural expressions to inform those racial narratives, to inform our attitudes and beliefs. So again, it's just trying to pull all those different elements together. So some of the key points I try to make in this conceptual paper is that cultural systems such as cultural racism undergird social conditions and institutions that shape racial inequalities in health, and that we also need to broaden what we're considering culture and cultural systems to be. It's all of these things, and all of them may play an important role in conjunction with each other and independently to help explain some of the patterns that we observe in health. And specifically that cultural racism is a source of social toxicity. So across these literatures, these forms of cultural communication are primarily talked about in terms of informing attitudes and beliefs. This is where bias comes from. This is where we get our stereotypes. This is how these stereotypes are maintained. I would argue, and that this is in the literature as well, just not as commonly represented, that exposure to that type of discourse, exposure to these types of images, are also a source of stress that might have implications for health. And importantly, that policies targeting racial health equity will benefit from integrating existing social theory and, meaningful assessment of racial context. There's a lot of work that's already out there that a lot of population health scholars, I would argue, are not meaningfully integrating into their initiatives, into their scholarship, and into their practice in ways that I think are really important. So let me give you a couple of methodological examples of how I'm trying to measure some of these relationships. So the first is a laboratory experimental approach where I was interested in the effects of media-based racism on physiological, emotional, and behavioral stress responses. So this is the idea that could media, just what you're consuming on Facebook, on Twitter, passively trigger physiological stress responses that might be problematic over time. And what I was interested in examining was that in 3 ways. So physiological expressions, behavioral, emotional, and thinking about media-based racism as an example of cultural racism, one form of cultural racism, right? So what I did was I created these blogs and put people, randomly assigned people to different conditions. They were exposed to either very blatant images, someone in blackface, KKK hood, use of the N-word, or they were assigned to a more subtle condition where Paul Ryan's blaming poverty on lazy inner city men, using racial codes, using racial imagery as humor, but not directly naming particular racial groups, or using race in a vitriolic way. And I was interested in whether blacks and whites would respond differently to this type of content. And what I found is that when the content is very blatant, this is an image of a white man in blackface dressed as Trayvon Martin for Halloween. When whites are exposed to this kind of content at the physiological level, particularly in terms of heart rate variability, become very disrupted. They're having a harder time controlling their heart rate when they're being exposed to that type of content. For blacks, we see the opposite effect, that when they're exposed to this very blatant content, they actually manage pretty well. So they're having a response, but they're handling it in a healthy way. They're able to regulate their heart rate. Once the content is gone, their heart rate comes back to normal, whereas whites, when the content is gone, their heart rate stays elevated. For blacks, it was the more subtle content that seemed to be more problematic. So these more subtle references to race in the media disrupted their physiology regulation more than for whites. For whites, on average, physiologically, it was like they weren't really seeing it. They weren't really reacting to it. And for blacks, they became very disrupted when they're viewing this type of content. What's interesting, though, in the argument that we make in the paper, is that both responses are actually problematic for blacks. So having to react to this type of content chronically, even if you're handling it well, is weathering, right? Eventually that rubber band gets worn out and it doesn't function as well, even if you're able to handle it. This is an 18 to 25-year-old sample. You can handle it at 18. What do you look like at 30 if you're having to react to this type of content over and over? And we already see the acute effect with subtle content, even with 18 to 25-year-olds being disrupted. So this was my first stab at saying, I think this cultural racism things matter. Other people have said this matters. How might I measure that and represent it in an empirical study? So this was the first shot to say, does even these brief exposures have an impact on health that might be problematic? But in this study, we're not measuring health. We're measuring a process. We're measuring an acute physiological response. So I wanted to start thinking about, well, how often are those types of exposures occurring in the media? Are blacks having to chronically respond to these very blatant racial imageries and more subtle racial imageries? So I started to think about ways to leverage data science approaches to collect large amounts of media data to start to assess it in various ways. So we've just finished creating, so the question is, how might we assess the prevalence of media-based racism and associations with population health? So we just finished creating a database of national media coverage from the top 10 national media sources from 2006 to 2018, tracking coverage of police violence in that period of time. And what we're observing is that there's a big jump that happens in 2009. So this jump, 2006 to 2008, is pretty steady, and then all of a sudden there's this big jump, and it stays high from that period. So what we're interested in is that, can we take that data and meaningfully connect it to population health data to see if we're also seeing changes in things like anxiety, substance abuse, when you're being exposed to police violence at a higher level of frequency. And at this first step, we're only interested in the frequency. We're basically saying that when you're exposed to police violence coverage, even if it's Black Lives Matter, even if it's people fighting back, you're still being exposed to this narrative around race and racial violence, and structural violence in ways that might have implications for your health. And so really it's building on that laboratory-based study saying that even when you view it for 6 minutes, it becomes problematic, and now we can look at a decade of exposure of police violence that's different from the previous decade to see if it might be having some meaningful associations with health. And the last project, which is what I'm really focused on right now, so I'll go into a little more detail, is really thinking about my experience with public discourse and being in white liberal spaces in particular, where people continue to misframe and misunderstand what structural racism is. And people have this tendency to want to hold on to individual representations of that phenomenon, right? We want to focus on bias. And everybody's doing the bias training. Let's focus and let's fix everyone's individual level of bias. And we want to, even if we move beyond that point, there's a tendency to sort of superficially use liberal language around race. So we throw around words like microaggressions and structural racism without really understanding what those things mean. But wanting to focus on white liberal audiences in particular, because I believe that's a group that's most likely to espouse beliefs of racial justice and racial equality, but don't have the deep understanding of how that actually shows up in people's lives in ways that I thought perhaps using virtual reality may help them connect with it in a different way. So what we've started to explore is whether an immersive virtual experience of racism can actually improve an understanding of realities of racism. Funny. So I did this, when I started this project, I had never used virtual reality. I'd never had a headset like this on my face. And I wrote a proposal and people gave me money to do a project on virtual racism, virtual reality and racism. But part of the reason I was able to do that is this guy on the right on my left is Jeremy Bailenson. He's a professor at Stanford. He's been working in VR for 20 years, thinking about social and behavioral applications of VR, but he hadn't really delved into racism. So I reached out to him and said, hey, I think about racism a lot. Would you be interested in working together to think about how to use VR? And he said, yes. I've been waiting for someone who that's not my lane, that's not my expertise, but I know it's important, I know it matters. Let's get together and see what we can create. We got funding from the Brown Institute for Media Innovation. It's really big because they paid for everything, and they told me to be sure to say their name. We also really took a very transdisciplinary approach to this. So Jeremy, he's a cognitive psychologist, but he's in a school of communication. He's been working in VR for 20 years. I'm a psychologist, social worker, who studies racism, but our team was also very diverse. So we have, people in sociology, communication studies, we had computer scientists, we had artists, all coming to us thinking about how do you represent emotion and experience and sentiment in a virtual experience in a way that makes sense for VR specifically. So I have to emphasize that it really took this big, very transdisciplinary team to produce this work. I'm sorry if this is a little dark, but the thing that we created was, who in here has done VR before? What type of VR? Did you do 360 videos, or have you been like another character?
It's like in a video game.
Video game? Uh-huh, yeah. Yeah. Video game type or?
Full immersive experience.
Yeah.
Navigating this world.
Yep. So there's generally kind of two different types, right? There's the 360 videos where you might see footage of a refugee camp and it feels like you're there and you can be with a family and observe what's happening, but you can't interact. It's just a video, you can't interact with the footage anyway, but you can observe it and feel like you're a part of it. This is a fully immersive experience where you become a different person. You can walk around, you can grab and interact with objects, we can have videos interact with you directly, and I'll give you some examples of how we do that. So you start to create an experience that may feel like this is happening to you, not to someone else that you're observing. So you go from fly on the wall to a first person point of view. So we create an experience where you become Michael Sterling as a child, an adolescent, and as an adult experiencing racism in different forms at different points in your life. In the first phase, you're in an elementary school classroom, you're playing with blocks, you can grab and throw these blocks, and these kids start to taunt you a little bit in the way that kids can do and not really understand the implications of their words, their language. So one of the kids, the guy on the far right, your far right, they're saying, throw the fireball, Mike, throw the scary black fireball. Black is always the scariest, right? And you're like, you know, usually most people in the headset get kind of mad and start throwing blocks at that kid, which is actually a video. So we filmed characters on a green screen, and then we basically cut and paste them. Not we, I have zero skills in that area. Very other fancy people did that. And we can make the videos interactive so that when you interact with the videos, we can change what they start to do. So when you throw that block, it actually triggers a white female teacher who's on this side who says, Mike, you're being dangerous. You're going to hurt someone. And when the other kids have been throwing blocks the whole time. And what's been interesting about this project, when we developed it, we built from an existing empirical body of literature that says disciplinary practices are different for black boys when they go through the same types of, they enact the same behaviors, they get disciplined differently. So we pull from that and bring it into a virtual experience. And you're surprised. You may not have even noticed the teacher to your left if you were just focused and looking down at the box. Why is she so upset with me? What did I do wrong? But when you throw the block, it triggers this response. In the second scene, another important component of this, I'll show you a video of it in just a second, are mirrors. So being able to see yourself in a mirror and being able to see your body move around, from Jeremy's side of the research, says that's important for feeling like this is happening to you. If we want it to feel like it's your body, you need to see the face, you need to see the body, you need to see the hands. So when you're that little boy, you have small brown hands. We have you sit down cross-legged on the floor playing with blocks. We want you to feel small. We want you to feel like a child. We also want you to see your face. So when you transition to the next age, when you're around 15, you see yourself in a mirror, you stand and look at your body for a while, and then you transition into your teenage bedroom. You can see a screen in the back that says breaking news, unarmed black teen killed by a police officer. You can look at your music posters and your snowboard. You can see basketball, a basketball that's on the ground that you can throw into the hoop. Again, we're trying to get you to use your body in the experience. You then hear a phone ring. You turn around and look for it. You can grab it, and it's your friend Adam who's waiting downstairs. So you click the phone, and then you're transported into your living room where Adam, your white male friend, is trying to take you to a basketball game. You're running late. Your mom, sitting on the couch, also a video, says, wait a minute. The police are looking for someone who's wearing something similar to you. You need to change. And Adam says, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. We're running late for the game. Mom insists, says, don't forget what happened to your brother. You grab your hoodie that's on the back of the chair. You hear it zip. You put it on. You go out the door. You're now on a street in Brooklyn. Adam's across the street saying, come on, hurry up. The neighbor behind you is saying, have a good game. I'm sorry I can't make it today. And all of a sudden you hear police sirens. Whoop, 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 whoop. The police car pulls up. They jump out and they're immediately aggressive with you. Get down on your knees and put your hands up. And we have you, the user in the headset, get on your knees, put your hands in the air while these officers are grilling you. You have done nothing except stand on the sidewalk. Again, we're drawing from existing data. Stop and frisk practices in New York City indicate that you could be just standing on a sidewalk and be aggressively accosted by a police officer with any justification that they come up with. There's a moment where you hear this yelling on the street, the neighbors, the police officers, where everything goes dark, the sound goes off, and you hear your mom's voice say, just do what you have to do to get home. Just get home alive. Comes back to your friend Adam, white guy. Oh, that was crazy. Shake it off, just shake it off. Let's get to the game. So we're trying to represent these levels, right? So yes, we have police violence. It's very salient in our public discourse, but it's also your mom having to worry about something like that and then actually happening. It's also that it's not the first time that something like that has happened in your family. It's your good friend completely misunderstanding the weight of what had just happened. Just shake it off. Completely not understanding what it was like for you to go through that experience. But you get to go through it wearing the headset and get to feel a little bit of what that's like. In the last scene, again, you see yourself in the mirror, you transition. You are in a workplace environment where you go and approach and put your resume, and the administrative assistant who's there kind of is a little bit snotty, right? Kind of looking at you like you're not supposed to be there. Oh, I see. You have a resume. Set your resume in your hand. Okay, you can put it in the basket. She doesn't reach out to grab it. She just kind of points that you're supposed to put it in the tray. You can see on the resume a Yale logo. So we're not overhyping Yale. We're just trying to give you some indication that you're pretty well educated. You might be qualified for the job. You put it in the tray, and then you go over and stand This guy, who was a little douchey in real life, also plays a douchey guy in the experience, who says, you know, he's kind of like blackening up the way he's talking to you. You know, these interviews are crazy, da da da. And then when the interviewer walks up, he preps it back up, right? When the interviewer walks up, he immediately approaches the white guy, does not look your way at all, and says, "You must be our candidate from Yale. We're so excited to meet you." And he says, "No, sir. I'm a proud graduate of Michigan State." Dig. And the administrative assistant in the back says, "No, actually, Michael Sterling's our candidate from Yale." That's when they both turn and look at you and acknowledge your presence for the first time. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you there. You don't mind if I take him back, do you?" So we're trying to imply that you were the candidate they were most excited to see. He assumed that candidate was the white male and not you. The end of the scene, you're back home in your bathroom, you get a voicemail. "You're an excellent candidate. We just don't think you're a good cultural fit for the organization." So I want to give you a sense of how we try to create body transfer. You're looking in the mirror. When your hand moves, the avatar's hand moves. When your head moves, when your body moves, it's all in perfect sync, moving at the same time. And so we want you to have to look, and this is an early draft of the classroom, we want you to have to look in the mirror and get this sense that when I'm moving, this is me, this is happening to me, right? We also want you to use your body in particular ways. So when we have you in the classroom, when we have you sit down and play with the blocks, when we have you in the police scene and you're down on your knees with your hands up, we want you to use your body physically in various ways. Excuse me. I'm going to play the trailer so you can get a sense of some of how it came together.
Leave that boy alone. He didn't do anything wrong.
That's how sick that's just brush it off.
You have now become Mike Sterling. Look at yourself in the mirror.
So those different elements, again, were important. It's not just the in-your-face stuff. It's also, you know, the more subtle things that we're trying to convey. When I started the project, I wanted to think about ways to capture structure. And it was, I just got another round of funding to try and explore that more and think about data visualization in VR. But with this piece, the way we got at that was showing that it's not just the one time it happens. It's not just the one time someone calls you a name. It's something that starts very early in life that you carry with you through and through and through. Now I have to express that it's been a little bit frustrating to do this work because it shouldn't be necessary. The data for this, it's already clear. People have been saying this for a long time. We're just repeating ourselves over and over and over again. But there's still this resistance to it, right? There's still these alternative explanations. There's a series, I think I took the slide out, a journalist, Nicholas Kristof, had this series in the New York Times called "When Whites Just Don't Get It." He's trying to like encapsulate all this work around structural racism. In the comment section, it's just mind-blowing, right? We're not responsible for their problems. If blacks are poor and in prison, it's all their fault. We all start from zero. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of our racial legacy of oppression and current forms of structural, institution, et cetera, oppression in our society. But that's not an uncommon discourse. And sometimes in schools of social work, we get a little bit skewed in the ways in which we talk about these kinds of problems. But you know, that's what the public discourse is. Get it together, you're the cause of this problem, right? We think about mass incarceration, we think about criminals who need to be regulated and fixed. We don't think about different applications of drug policies for different types of people and different types of crimes and how that helps contribute to mass incarceration. And part of what this work is arguing is that we have to frame the problem accurately in order to leverage accurate solutions to that problem. If we frame the problem of mass incarceration as a problem with criminals, then we will help fix criminals. If we think it's a problem with drug policy, then we will start fixing drug policies. So I would make that argument for thinking about racism more broadly. So we started to think about ways in which we could publicly engage with this work. So we premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in April, which is really, really interesting space because before we went to this film festival, which is a pretty big film festival, we had run like 10 people through it. So to then have hundreds of people go through it at once was a little anxiety provoking, but it was so fascinating to me, and I learned so much about the work. So one, I learned a lot about presumably white liberals who were probably coming to the film festival, their earnest interest in engaging with this work, rushing up to sign up, to volunteer, to experience racism. And I didn't expect myself to react so strongly to just that imagery of, I know you could keep going and do the fun like music game that's right next door, you're doing this also. So that was really interesting. I also didn't know what it would feel like for Black people to see white people experiencing racism in VR and how emotional that would be. So multiple people, especially those who were at the festival multiple days, would talk about watching white people over and over and over again on their knees with their hands up, and how emotional that was for them to see. And I still don't quite know what's going on. We've also seen, I'll show you some comments that we got from people from the festival, but we've also, as you might imagine, seen really different reactions from people of color, from Black people who go through the experience, and whites who go through the experience. I'll give you a couple of examples. I have a white colleague who went through the experience, and a couple of months later came to me and said she was standing on the street and a police officer was walking toward her and she got scared, felt her heart rate jump. And she said, I don't like the police necessarily, right? Social issue, but I've never been afraid of the police. And she attributed that to going through the VR experience. It was sticking with her, it was lingering with her in a way that I'm still grappling with, like, is that the way I'm trying to have an impact? Is that a good thing or not? I'm still thinking through that. Had a Black male put on the headset, knew it was about racism, forgot to tell him there was a police scene. He gets to the police scene, it's like a celebratory event, it's our first time doing the demo, and he lifts the headset up during the police scene like he's going to stop, puts it back on, finishes. When I talked to him later, I said, what was going on, what happened? He said, I couldn't hear what the police officer was saying, and I was afraid of what was going to happen if I didn't follow instructions. So one is suggesting it's not a video game. That's different than a video game. And also the implications are different for different people going through the experience. For Blacks in particular, we seem to be tapping into, as I would expect, very specific, real memories, threats, and things that may have happened right before they walked up to put the headset on. These are not hypotheticals for the people we are representing in this experience. For white people, it also seems to be tapping into something very emotional that's different than watching a video or only having a discussion. So we've started to think about what are some other ways that we can use this experience to capitalize on what we're doing. So we had a white wall. When people came out of the headset, they would write things on the wall with the black marker. Some of the things are saying, you think you know how something feels until you experience it. Eye-opening, we have such a long way to go. Projects like these bring us one step closer. Can't stop thinking about this project. This is someone who came back later and wrote on the wall. Harrowing, powerful out-of-body experience. The inability to choose or change Michael's fate hit home. We need more experiences like this in the VR world. Truly eye-opening. So we're doing a couple of different things. We're running a few different types of studies where we're trying to assess what are the effects of going through something like this. Our main sample is white. People who are identifying on a range of the political ideological spectrum, but we're interested in shifts in things like empathy, racial bias, implicit bias, but we're also interested in ways in which they kind of engage these issues in real world ways. So we're giving them media clips, for instance, and we have them respond to the same media clip at multiple time points to see if their assessments of what's happening in that news incident is changing, and maybe in very subtle ways over time. So in these studies, we get data from them at baseline before they know we're interested in race or racism or really anything what they're doing other than virtual reality. We get those baseline measures. 2 weeks later, they come into the lab, they go through the VR experience, or they don't do VR at all. They answer those same questions again, and then 3 weeks later, we follow up to see if there's been any kind of lingering effect or change. We're also doing a study with our first year master's students. So I helped design a course that's now mandatory for our first year master's students in social work, which is Power, Racism, Oppression, and Privilege. They all have to take it. That's now our foundations course, actually. And half of those students also did the VR in addition to the class. So they have journal entries, they have a role play at the end of the semester, so we're evaluating whether the VR is doing anything in addition to, is it supplementing this course? And what we're thinking, where we're landing is, it's not the VR itself, it's what you do with people when they come out of the headset that's probably most powerful, most impactful over the long term. We also collect data at film festivals and various technological events. We get data in the headset. You can respond to survey questions, you can sign petitions, we can get background information about you. And so in like the mobile studies, for instance, we have people respond to whether they support a race-related policy. We ask that question before they start the VR or ask that question after. They're randomly assigned to one of those. Those are our conditions. We're also, and this is kind of the result of premiering this at the Tribeca Film Festival, we've been approached by a lot of companies who are saying, we have all these diversity equity initiatives, nothing's working, might we be able to use this as a tool? We've been very clear that we don't know if this works or what this does at all. This may have the opposite effects of, maybe we're increasing bias, we don't know. But lots of companies have been interested in trying it out. So we've been working with people to establish these very sort of community partnerships to think about how to implement it within an organization, which will make it easier for us to track change over time, and they have existing measures of behavior and performance, what subgroups make sense. Because VR is still so clunky, it takes time to set up the equipment and put people through the experience. We're thinking about targeting small groups of people, so like C-suite level managers, partners, directors who establish policy, set the tone for culture, targeting those groups within organizations to think about how to use this. We're also partnering with, which is not really reflected here, nonprofits like Planned Parenthood are interested in working with their leadership as well. So again, these are people who already have this leaning of justice, equality, and are willing to go deeper and do some more work and connect more deeply with these issues. I talked about that already. So really the premise of this virtual reality work in general, but really I think the way I approach my scholarship more broadly is that achieving racial justice requires that we understand racism, and not an understanding that emerges from intellectual exercise or even in the consumption or production of science, but rather a visceral understanding that connects to spirit and body as much as reason. And for me, I think the virtual reality experience is getting us a little bit closer to that real emotional connection as opposed to something that we intellectualize and keep out there separate from ourselves. So I'll stop there and take any questions or comments.
How many of the headsets do you have now?
I have 5. The Stanford lab has a big, there's different ways you can set it up. They have a big, like formal virtual reality lab where you have speakers on the floor that shake and all sorts of things like that. I have an empty classroom that they gave me to set up the equipment. But we've also been able to partner with different hardware companies who will donate for nonprofits, for educational purposes. They're very eager, like having a Mac versus a PC, they're eager to be the hardware that people use for this way. So there's definitely lots of options to be able to get it for free or at a discount.
And so for the film festival, you brought your 5?
No, we just did one booth, and people had to sign up for a time slot, and we just ran as many as we could. When we go do demos or events at organizations, we might set up 3 different stations so that we can run more people at a time. Some of these events have thousands of people at them. We're trying to get as many people as possible through. But for that film festival, we just did the one booth.
You said the most impactful part would be the discussion after they go through the VR. Ideally, what would that discussion entail? Just a debrief of how they're feeling, or have you seen it work in practice?
I don't know yet what the best way is. My instinct is that a class is probably best, and so maybe we'll get some insights from our first-year students who took the class in addition to doing the VR. I think it's really my instinct is that what the VR might do is help people be more open and engage in a different way than they would have if they didn't do the VR. Again, especially if you're thinking about white liberals as your target audience, that group is most likely to think you're not talking to them when you're having these kinds of conversations. And so this piece, and I've seen people come out, people come out in tears, people come out saying, I've been at the rallies, I've signed the petitions, I think about this all the time, I never really connected with it like this, which suggests to me that that group that already has that leaning is being pushed just a little bit more so that when you have a conversation afterwards. In the ways in which we're thinking about it, and the companies, we don't have a semester. So we're thinking about small focus groups that we might break into. I've given presentations on the work afterwards and then like facilitated a conversation with a group of people after. So I think that can be useful as well. But I think it's the kind of class you're taking, it's these classes where you're really digging into these sorts of issues in depth, that this might set a different tone for that engagement. Mm-hmm.
Was there any follow-up for the folks who are going through this experience in like the film festival context afterwards, or just like here's the wall to write a feedback comment if you want, and like thanks for coming? That's it.
And we really struggled with sending people off, right, in tears. Some people, we were always there to talk to people. So me or one of my students were there. People wanted to talk and unpack and process. People often did. Some people didn't want to talk at all. Kind of my clinical training as a social worker came in handy a couple of times, where people like just sort of rushed out of the booth, and I just read them as they're not okay and went after them and said, hey, do you want to talk? And she's having a hard time. Processing is a little bit overwhelming. So we've really struggled with doing it at big events like this where people just come in and leave. So we've tried to create space where they can write in a journal, that they can write on the wall, some little way that they can connect. But ideally, that's not what's happening. Ideally, even if it's not right after, at some point in that day, you have a chance to kind of unpack it and talk about it. When we did it at the school, we had a separate room with some of our clinical social worker faculty sitting in the room, and they would talk to people after they've gone through it. And it was always private. It was set up so that it was private to give our students a chance to process it. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how you make decisions about what scenarios to depict. I'm thinking about some of the things that we see on an ongoing basis include the policing of black bodies by whites, Barbara Becky, all these individuals who take it upon themselves to correct black behavior or report black behavior, like sleeping.
Yep.
How do you make choices about maybe a scenario like that, and what would be your goals? What would be the goal for understanding for someone who participates in that?
Yeah, it was difficult, right? We started with an initial whiteboard of just hundreds of things on the whiteboard where we were all referencing these moments, these things that represent the complexities of our experiences with racism, and boiled it down to these scenarios. We decided that we wanted to start at sort of an introductory level, but not be so reductive. So we tried to represent some nuance in these experiences. I would envision, so we're working with a different team now of storytellers, filmmakers who are taking the bones of what we created and reimagining it and adding complexity and depth in collaboration with us. But I would also imagine potentially a series where you get a little bit deeper into how some of these things show up. So for instance, one of the things that came up for me was this notion of the ways in which black and brown people calculate their movements, their emotional expression, in their reading the room and other people, and if there's some way that you could capture that act in virtual reality, having to do that, those subtle adjustments we often make. So things like that were harder for me to think about how to capture. So we started with things that we felt like we had a grasp on, that we could represent in this medium. We're also not filmmakers or storytellers in that way, so getting at things that are a little more abstract were harder for us to do. But I think that's an excellent example of the type. It happens all the time, and you could actually represent that particular example pretty easily. But really try to start with what would happen in second grade, what would happen at 15, what would happen in a workplace, and using that to try and boil it down to something that was manageable.
And actually things like everyday racism examples of that. We have the data on people's reports of everyday racism not being treated with respect. Perhaps a VR version of that would help it to sink in. Like, what is that process?
What does it actually feel like? Yeah.
So earlier you talked about collective imaginaries, the status hierarchies, and how at places that have diversity and strategic plans, they often use language that is soft, like microaggressions. Do you think in some ways that could be, I guess, received as a cultural threat?
Shifting that language?
Yeah, because it placates the status hierarchies.
Yeah. I think a lot of people think they want to change and don't actually want to change, and when you really start to unpack how it shows up in their organization, that will require pretty transformative shifts in how they function as an organization. I think that's going to be problematic and challenging for people. We've started with, and we haven't gotten into the nitty-gritty yet, so I don't quite know how people are going to respond. We've started with really, thinking about organizations that have an explicit narrative commitment to racial equity specifically. To me, that's a sign that they're a little bit more advanced than people who are just like have diversity and that's how they're thinking about it, and they think, if I have a mix of people in the pot, then it's all good. We're where we need to be. But I think when we get into the weeds of just how ingrained it is into everything that they're doing, it's going to be difficult for people and will be experienced as a threat. And they have an option not to invite us back and keep doing what they've been doing. But it's my hope that there are some organizations that really want to do their work differently. We'll see whether that's true or not. Did that get it to your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Right, thanks for this talk. I mean, that was, in terms of just like advancing the field, holy crap, I was like mind blown. This is a lot of the stuff that I'm trying to grapple with as someone who does structural work. And I'm curious to learn more about your data science project and kind of how you're planning to incorporate that into your VR work. So yeah, I would love to learn more about that. That's offline.
I don't know what I was thinking when I did that data science project. That's been going on for great idea, but in practice, I have zero skills. So really struggled with it for 3 years, trying to build that database. My students are trying to learn how to do these things. I finally got money to hire a master's student who's in the Data Science Institute who did this in like 2 months. And we've been struggling for 3 years. But that project is a little bit different than what I was talking about, this new virtual reality project. So we got a separate set of funds to think about. It's kind of related, data visualization, but really it's taking the data we already have around structures and interpersonal and cultural, and how do you leverage people connecting with and understanding that data using VR. I don't really know how I'm going to go about it yet. It's kind of the way I approached the first project. I had a big idea, and then I want to build the team of people who like to work across disciplines, who have expertise in data visualization, who have expertise in storytelling, and imagine what we would create together. But that's what that VR project is focused on, that people have seen this data over and over and over again. They're resisting it. Is there a way you can incorporate it into VR? It could be, some people represent graphs where you can walk through the graphs and look around. I'm thinking about it more so, how do you tie it to the narrative? How do you tie it to a meaningful narrative that's really explicitly based in empirical data, and that's what's happening. Empirical data informed this as well, but that's not explicit in the experience that you're going through.
What I also kind of stuff I was talking when you're just talking right now is that I feel like as someone who's being trained as a PhD right now in public health, I don't have the skills to be embarking on where the field is going, which is like use of data science, use of algorithms, use of machine learning, use of like natural language processing. These are all things that are like well out of the social science wheelhouse. And I'm trying to figure out a way to address my gap, right? Like in terms of, you're talking a lot about gaps, and so I feel like we, as in this field, are training ourselves with gaps. And
you always have a gap, right? Especially when, like the point I was saying about solving the problems of your discipline versus the problems of the world. You couldn't have enough degrees to, certificates, whatever, to do all the things you need to do. And to me, it's really about strategic partnerships. So I'll give you an example. My colleague, Desmond Patton, who's a social worker, he was a professor here, now he's a professor at the School of Social Work, does machine learning and data science. He's not trained in that at all. He's partnered with people and brought his very important perspective as a social worker and has changed the way they do their work. He didn't have to be trained in what they were doing. They did their part and he did his part, right? And so it's really how those things come together. But we have also just started, we just got another pot of funds to start a university center thinking about the intersections of emerging technology and social justice that's grounded in the principles of social work. And part of that, we're creating a curriculum for social workers who want to be trained in the basics of data science, who want to understand how to code in virtual reality, how do they use virtual reality, because we think social workers are important and social scientists in general are important to those conversations, and they're often absent from those rooms. And so we're thinking about not only how should people who are being trained in those disciplines use the technology in their work, but how can they push back, like Desmond? They realize their algorithms do not work with kids on the south side of Chicago in their language and their ability to try to compute language. Do not work unless you have kids from the south side of Chicago coding that data. Right? That changes, that fundamentally shifts what they're doing. So creating more opportunities like that for social workers, social scientists to push the tech when it's in earlier phases of development. So they're not thinking, so Facebook is not on the bad end of, oh, what do we do? Right? If you had talked to some social workers earlier on, you might not have been there. So creating those opportunities earlier in the process and helping those people use and integrate the technology. Not you learning how to do VR, I don't have time for that. But with the right partner and funding, my perspective is important for getting that work done. And their skills are important, and we can work together to do it. So I would say starting to find opportunities for those partnerships. It might be another doctoral student who's in a completely different department who has to learn data science. You need questions answered on the public health side. Why not use your content for their skill development? Yes, Chanel?
Yeah, so just what was mentioned before, I mean, this has just been so, just so engaging and so important and so helpful, so thank you so much for what you do. Although I'm really interested in the VR stuff, I'm still stuck at study 1, where you found these differences in cardiovascular responses across race, and that was very striking to me. And so I'm wondering, aside from the race differences and the blatant versus the subtle sorts of racism, did you see any gender differences as well?
No, not yet. That's the problem when you're doing too much. You don't go deeply enough into all the things you could assess, which, you know, that's an invitation to the many bright students in the room who might need data and they want to use data that maybe they can't get other places. Would love for you to write data. You write papers using this data. But no, we haven't looked at the gender differences yet. And there's lots of other factors, right, that we're just averaging based on race. That's very blunt. There's lots of nuance that we're missing. So we have data on their racial identity, their experiences with racial discrimination, their political ideologies, and what might contribute to some of those differences. I had a white male, for instance, in the subtle condition, his heart rate spiked. That was kind of like one of the highest I've seen. That was comparable to one of the black females in the study. And I don't know why that is. There may have been others. It may not have been such a obvious spike, but there's probably variation in the white group. There's variation in the black group that we're not yet picking up on. Might be gender, might be some other factors. Also interesting with that data, about half of the sample was collected before Trayvon Martin was killed and half was collected after. So you also have these kind of social events that are happening that might change how people are reacting and experiencing these sorts of things. I know for me, which led me in that whole different direction with some of my research after Trayvon Martin was killed, that was a major event for me that shifted the ways I was engaging and thinking about these sorts of issues, even though of course it was happening before that, and I think that was true for much of the country. And so the fact that half of the sample was collected before and after might be meaningful to assess. So there's lots of different variations that I think are important that we haven't gotten to yet. Amos?
What it actually pointed out was the study in race without racism. And as you've been doing your work, as you engage faculty, have you noticed any shifts in the way that folks who have been looking at race without racism? Is there a shift to do more of that, or is there tension around that? And if there is it because there's a lack of skill, lack of interest, or a lack of understanding of the interconnection or the necessity?
I think people say they want to do something different. I don't see them doing anything different. Certainly in my postdoctoral training in public health, someone was presenting some data on mortality. They had this stray black male dot that was way off from everybody else. Just kind of mentioned it, moved on to the next slide. I'm like, hold up, like, what's that dot? Why is that off from everything else? But she wasn't even really equipped to even begin to unpack why that was the case. And again, similar to you working with someone with data science skills, you need to be partnering with people who do understand it and not just put that out to the world. So I hear lip service of people saying, yes, that is so important. And that's not new. People have been saying, yes, racism is important. And like I'm saying, nobody's integrating this whole vast body of conceptual empirical literature that has particular comments on what they should and could be doing, and they are not doing it. So I mean, part of that's kind of rooted in the virtual reality project, not thinking about academics in particular, but you know the data. You've seen your own data where we're still more likely to die even when you account for education and income, and haven't meaningfully grappled with that and haven't gone to the literature to try to think about why that's the case. The data's already there. We've already said all this. Everybody's already said this. James Jackson will say, oh yeah, we did that study in 1982, right? People have been talking and doing this for a long time. It's not landing. They're not using it. They're not shifting. They keep describing differences by racial groups in terms of health without unpacking what that box means. So I hear people saying it, don't see the shifts. People keep inviting me to give talks though. They like talking about it. So I don't know what the next push is to really hold people accountable for, you know.
Well, I mean, just think about the VR. I just, you know, with those examples, people are probably situated in lives that are very distant from there. But just the possibilities, maybe 5, 10 years down the line, of like for faculty to sit in the space, or you know, a faculty that sit across from them every day. So, you know, to think about how does racism function when it's time to be promoted for tenure. Right. People talk about it, know about it, but it's different. When I say I've sat in VR, now I'm at a table actually judging somebody's tenure, that it might impact the way people make judgments around their research.
And I think that component is so important, because I think when we talk about issues of racism, particularly in white liberal spaces, there's a distancing. I took out a slide that had a whole white choir, because people tell me, why are you preaching to the choir? Because I'm like, the choir needs to be preached to. That's like, oh, that is terrible, that thing is happening out there in that space, not in here in the way we function and do our work. And that distance is really problematic. I've been surprised, though, with this piece. We certainly try to think explicit the VR work. We try to think explicitly about juxtaposing whiteness to what was happening, and not just letting you say, oh, the secretary was just having a bad day. We tried to use whiteness in very particular ways. But even with that intention, I've been surprised with a number of people who've come out and said, I felt like I was Michael, but my whiteness was also becoming very salient to me, and how different my experience is from that. And so I'm not quite sure what we're doing that's creating that effect, or if that effect is consistent and worth talking about, but doing that is very, very important. And I've thought about a separate piece, and I haven't had time to even try to do it, but a whole piece focused on making whiteness visible to white people. The ways in which they don't have to own race, they don't have to own whiteness, have the option to say whether it's their identity or not, and not deal with it, that it's a social status that's separate from their personal identification. I think something that focuses explicitly on that is important. Side note, there's also people working in the space of thinking about using this as a tool for racial healing, restorative justice, and not focus on white people at all. What would I create for us specifically? It probably wouldn't be that. But what would it be? But I think there's a lot of, I went in skeptical. I'm convinced that there's a lot of possibility if the right people are working with the tool. And the right people probably don't have VR tech skills.
Could you tell us what 1,000 cuts means?
So it comes from this ancient Chinese torture technique of gradually cutting someone, or they die with 1,000 cuts over time. And it's really trying to capture these daily insults, these daily threats, these daily cuts that many people of color have to grapple with every day, and how it's not always a police officer yelling in your face. Sometimes it's your colleague and how they're evaluating a candidate, and not recognizing that they're being racist, or not recognizing how our policies and practices are discriminatory, are also cuts. And so just trying to represent the many, many, many ways that this shows up every day, in ways that often go over the heads of people who haven't had to deal with it or experience it directly.
Kind of academic question, and like, where do you publish such conceptual type of papers? Because I've gotten a lot of, like, that paper, Linda's like gotten to experience one of the papers I wrote, but I can't seem to find anywhere that was willing to engage with the arguments I'm putting forward. which is structurally like this is due to racism, and like no one's willing to take it.
It's a struggle, right? And it's a struggle that it's, you know, that's why every time I give this talk it says under review, because I've had to submit another revision of the paper. But I found some traction. I'll tell you how I got there. So when in my postdoc, I did that study where I'm exposing people to media. And in that paper, I was trying to make this conceptual argument about cultural racism and this methodological approach I was using to do it. It was too much for one paper. Finally, I think it was David Williams said, you need to pull it out. That's 2 different papers. That's when I wrote the conceptual paper on cultural racism, and then went down that whole rabbit hole of how everybody studies and talks about culture and trying to integrate that in a meaningful way. But that's now an R&R under review again with Milbank Quarterly. And I talked with a white colleague because I was framing that piece specifically to people who study discrimination and racism and trying to push that group to think more explicitly about cultural racism. My white colleague, who doesn't work in this space at all, he said, everybody who studies race in relation to health should be thinking about the issues you're raising in this paper. So I shifted it just a little bit. I didn't change most of the paper. I changed the policy points. I changed the introduction to say anybody who's using race as a variable in relation to health needs to be reading this paper and thinking about it. Got an R&R from Milbank Quarterly, thinking about that group, and very positive, like thoughtful reviews, which was the first time that's happened with this particular paper. The empirical paper is straddling right psychology, it's straddling public health, so that's been challenging, but that's an R&R with social science and medicine, which has been generally, this is kind of like a good space for me to publish. But I'm finding even like, you know, and more senior people like David and others are getting published in JAMA and like, you know, New England Journal of Medicine, and some of these, the medical literature is also trying to shift. Again, that's kind of what I'm talking about. People have been talking about social determinants of health for a long time, but some of these more distant areas of public health that weren't dealing with the social components, medical literatures are moving toward, and I think they are starting to look for some of this as well. The trick is tailoring what you're trying to say to that audience so they understand what you're saying. And it's difficult when you're so transdisciplinary. You know, that culture paper, I'm integrating psychology, sociology, law, public health, media and communication studies into one paper and trying to make that make sense to myself and everybody else. So that's really, really difficult. But so it may just be more revisions to get there.
Okay, we're going to let that be the last
Thank you.
question. I'd like to thank Dr. Cogburn for a great talk.